Video running? Welcome, everyone. My name, I think, is Stephen Goodman, and I've had the privilege to be doing a course called the Poetics of Enlightenment, and this is the penultimate meeting tonight. And the premise of the course has been that Poetics of Enlightenment could be read two ways. One, poetics, the wide range of what that might mean, is enlightening, awakening, transforming. And that enlightenment, a kind of technical Buddhist term in English, is itself poetic, that is to say, productive of many amazing, wondrous, radiant, transformative energies, which are seen within the orbit of traditional Buddhism as compassionate rays from the ground of being. So they serve a kind of moral and ethical purpose, enlightening poetically beings in dark times or times of light. And we've explored both Western modalities of poetics and Indian in particular, Vedic, and then Buddhist, Indo-Tibetan crazy saints, Mahasiddhas, great adepts, such as Naropa Saraha, and so on. And my dear colleague and friend George Quasha and Susan Quasha, we had seemingly a chance meeting, perhaps before some of you were born, 1974, when we were summoned to Naropa University. And the course that George taught was...
Oh, poetry?
No, but Western, something, yeah, poetry, okay, poetry. Yeah.
Also there's one called Oniropia.
Oniropia, right. And it was a time that Gregory Bateson was there, and I was teaching a course. We couldn't use Sanskrit words, so I called it Buddhist psychology, and somehow here we are. If you get on the website GeorgeQuasha, QUASHA.com.
No, Quasha.com.
Oh, Quasha.com. Don't get on George Quasha, unless you're invited. Quasha.com, you'll see a wide variety of poesis. Tonight, I'd like to begin by invoking one of the twin energies of the enlightened state, wisdom, which goes with compassion, and in the form of the great Bodhisattva Manjushri, also known as gentle splendor. And what I'd like to do is first invoke with his mantra, feeling it from the spacious ground, and with the invocation, then a musical evocation, and then into the pond. Chanchub Sempa, Champo Jonur Girpala Chagsa Lo. Homage to Bodhisattva, Manjushri Kumara Bhutta. Bodhisattva vows never to abandon the wheel of existence until all beings are freed. Acts, minding the good for oneself and others. Knows his acts as no acts, flux of form and space. Dedicates all his due to others, no complacency. Manjushri, gentle splendor, the ease and penetrating glance of enlightened mind. He wears the crown of 5 points and ornaments of the Bodhisattva. He holds in the right hand, which signifies compassionate action, the sword that cuts the twofold veiling, wavering emotion and misted intellect. In the left hand, signifying understanding, the lotus, the flowering of wisdom. The book, Prajna Paramita, ever increasing appreciations. Kumara Bhuta, in form of youth, ever youthful, new, renew at each instant. His throne, sun and moon laying on the lotus, irradiant process. His being beheld, envisioned, a light point, no thing. The ceiling gaze is polar process and not some sort of stuff. Mangalam.
Is that it? It's dark, huh? Thank you. That was beautiful. By the way, if anybody can't hear, come closer. And is this audible to everybody? Yeah. Great. So, do I talk now? Shifting from that level to the next level is a little difficult because I want to invoke the idea of a discourse that calls everything into question at every moment, so that the idea of a Poetics of Enlightenment can possibly be projected from one moment to the next. That's where I want to come in on this question of the Poetics of Enlightenment. There are literally infinite ways that we can approach the question of what poetics is and what enlightenment is. I've been, for the last 12 years, a kind of doing a sort of sub-piece called Art Is, Poetry Is, Music Is, in which I film artists saying what art is, poets saying what poetry is, and musicians saying what music is. And the idea behind this was never that I would find out what it is, or that it would be supposed that anybody who was speaking would know what it is, in the sense that any of those things could be considered a definable object. But I wanted to create a circumstance in which an impossible question is addressed as something one must inevitably engage. If you are a poet, you cannot avoid forever the question of what it is, even though you may never think an answer to that question. The question is implicit in the very nature of the activity. And if you continue to write poetry over many years, or make art over many years, or music over many years, that's going to evolve in a way that it's always right at the edge of being unknown, known, unknown, known. So my question was would it be possible to engage people at that edge? So in the interest of that, I filmed over 1,000 poets, artists, and composers in 11 countries in 24 languages over the last 12, 13 years. And a good deal of the evidence of that's on the internet at my site, Quasha.com, or under my name at Vimeo.com. And I'll continue to post those. I've only edited perhaps a third of what I've actually filmed. But people ask me the question, well, were there certain things that recurred in what people said, so that we could think, well, there's a majority view, or something like that. And my answer to that is that I created this piece so that I would never ask that question. Because from a sociological point of view, you might want to know what percentage of poets think that poetry is related to enlightenment, for example. You might find a much smaller percentage than you'd think who would actually think that thought of existing poets or artists, certainly an even smaller number of artists, probably a larger number of musicians. But that's, to me, what does that prove? Of what interest is it to know what people think passively about what something that is by its nature not passive? Who cares, actually? Because just knowing the answer to that question in any historical, sociological sense is deadening to the mind. It's not going to help you listen to music. It's not going to help you read poetry. In my view, it's going to impede that action. So, and yet, at any given moment, we know what it is. At any given moment, we can even say what it is in the truth of that moment. But the truth of that statement as much as it may want to, doesn't live much beyond the saying. The next moment that you're engaged with either writing, reading, or being in the presence of, in some other sense, the poetic or the artistic or whatever it happens to be, is not going to yield to that definition. And if it does, you're probably not listening. You're probably not engaged with the art form in terms of what it is to itself. So the better question might be, if not for my piece called Poetry Is or whatever, but, and I tell people when I'm filming them, please don't prepare a statement. We're going to have a conversation, and usually the conversation lasts a long time. I may only use 1 minute, 2 minutes, or 3 minutes of what they say, but we may talk for an hour or more. Elaine, I think we talked for an hour and a half or something like that when I filmed you. And I don't listen to the pieces. I don't watch them afterward. I wait till the moment of editing so that when I go through it, I don't have an idea projected about it. It's what it is at that moment. If I edited the piece on another day, I would probably do it very differently. So the piece itself is an embodiment of the perplexity of being in the question of what something is that's not going to let you know. The very art form is going to undermine whatever it is that it allows you to say or think at that moment. It's the nature of the beast to undermine any way of knowing what it is. And civilization is committed to ignoring this fact. At any given moment, it wants to know. How can you say what a great poet is if you don't know what poetry is? How can you say what the canon of poets that we should preserve and let the others go is if you don't know what poetry is? So you can't, really. You just do what you do and who you like or who you understand or who you get to at that moment. But I want to try approaching it in a non-historical way, even though I'm completely a student of the historical nature of these questions. I'm not ignoring that one, and I think probably a lot of that has been an aspect of this course. So I want to approach it from the non-historical aspect of it. So the better question that I was about to say a moment ago than what is it would be, what is it to itself in the moment that it is coming to be? And how could you know what that is? Is it possible to be in the presence of the question in such a way that it yields in some kind of powerful event of mind in the engagement? That would be my question. So, in order to frame this a little bit kind of broadly, and this does touch upon the historical, the historical as well as the non-historical, I suppose, the atemporal, because both exist simultaneously, is to ask the question. When I speak about this, I'm going to be consulting my mind as though it wants to say something that it's never said before. And yet I'm going to say some things to you that I think about a lot, and so it's going to come out as though I think about it a lot, and because I do, and as though I have a point of view about it. So I'm going to have to make a very crucial distinction under the label that nothing that I say is true beyond the moment of my saying it, and that I am committed to not speaking the truth beyond the moment of my saying it. And nevertheless, I'm going to say certain things in certain ways that are going to sound as though I don't think that way. Okay? And here's the paradox. I'm going to say something about what the nature of a concept is and what the nature of a principle is. And I have to say this in order to frame the way that I'm going to approach this question. We think in concepts. We speak in concepts. And if George Lakoff had actually shown up, he was supposed to come tonight, I was going to relate this to his way of talking about metaphor. And I'm also going I was also going to challenge him a little about certain things that he says in a gentle and appreciative way, because I appreciate his enterprise. We think in concepts, we cannot speak without them. And at certain moments we valorize concept to a very high degree. And then we create something like conceptual art. Seems to be, the people who do conceptual art sometimes think that art has evolved to this higher level called conceptual art. Now we have to deal with conceptual poetry, and some people think that it has evolved to this level of conceptual. And I would like to sort of deconstruct that by looking at what the word conceptual means. Aristotle looked at it as a mental convenience. So a concept is, first of all, a mental convenience. It's something we cannot not have, not use. Now principle, before I say more about concept, I want to say something more about, I want to invoke the notion of principle. What is a principle? Well, there thousands of definitions of principles and lots of ways of using it, but the way that I'm using it is that a principle is something that we observe to be so, whether or not we can fully define it, but we know it's there. Let's take like the principle of whatever we call gravity. Hold an object up and it seems to fall toward the center of the planet. And so we could say that there's a principle involved here, that the principle shows up as I hold this object here, let it go, and it goes there. So now I have a name for that, and I call it gravity. And if I'm Newton, I'll call it the law of gravity. And that will give it a legal status, and so anything that violates that is obviously illegal. And it can't be, it can't really be. Of course, in contemporary physics, it's a much more complex issue. And proving that gravity is what we say it is not an easy matter. And physicists have backed off at certain points on certain aspects of that question. But they know that there's something going on. There's something happening. And that's a principle. But any way that they would engage a discourse of saying what that is or even exploring what it is involves concepts. So the paradox of the principle is that it, in some sense, exists, but it doesn't exist the way other things exist. It exists as something we seem to know, but can't really fully grasp. And when we name it, we undermine the possibility of seeing it in perhaps another way. And yet there's no alternative but to talk about it with these concepts. Now, to go to a sort of a simpler and maybe even simplistic level for the purpose of illustrating what I'm saying, let's take a conceptual art piece, okay? In a conceptual art piece, a concept is understood pretty well. And the work may or may not be an exploration into the possibility of how that can be, or it may move closer to an illustration of what that concept is. The artist may conceive of it in different ways. I mean, there are many different ways of conceiving of the concept of conceptual art. And there are huge tomes of people's disagreement about what conceptual art is. And I'm not trying to minimize the importance of that or pretend that it's not extremely interesting. And I'm using this as a sort of parallel example to the far more complex issue of what we mean when we say the word enlightenment, which actually is precisely the same situation. But let me go on with this. If I have a concept and I want to make a conceptual work, my effort could be to embody the concept in the work so that when you look at the work, the concept is completed in your mind and in your eye and in your senses all simultaneously, and there it is. A very great conceptual work might exhaust the concept. That is to say, there might not even be a need to do another one such work because this one really did it, and now that concept is done. So you could say that a concept is embodied, defined, shown, completed, any of these things by the work that comes out of it. A principle is never exhausted by any instance of itself. It's just the instance of itself. Now, take one that I'm very familiar with and have worked with for a long time, in Tai Chi Chuan or Taoist Principles. You could say that there's a principle of alignment, let's say, and that things are freer when they're aligned. I call this the Axial Principle, and that's how I work with it. That when things are not resisting gravity, they're freer. When they honor their own structure and embody themselves in terms of what they are, they're freer. They have more options. Now that's a principle. You work with that when you're practicing, when you're doing this, and this would be very similar in many other instances of practice, that you would have an idea that is expressed in concepts, but these are attempts to open up the possibility of getting close to that principle. So the better concepts would get me closer. They would be functional. They would be better concepts because they're helping me to actually realize my relationship to that principle. But it'll be a little bit like the sort of Wittgensteinian thing of kicking away the ladder that got you to the point. You're not going to continue to use those concepts once you actually touch the principle and you realize what the principle is. Those concepts are now, there's no need for them anymore. They simply got you there. And now you're in the presence of an experience, of perhaps, you could call it an experience, or some sort of realization, some point at which actually merging with that or knowing that or being in the presence of that in such a way that it has its force no longer needs the concepts, and now other concepts seem to come into play. In other words, concepts become self-generating when they're actively an expression of an effort to get in touch with a principle. Okay, try to make this slightly less abstract relative to the question of the Poetics of Enlightenment. Poetics would be, in that sense, anything that we can think that brings us closer to the understanding of the core principle, however we conceive it, however we understand that to be. So poetics would be, in that sense, a temporary array of conceptual maneuvers that bring us close to a possibility that we understand only to the extent that we conceptualize it at the initial point, but haven't realized. Poetics is not prescriptive in that sense. Poetics is forward-looking description of a way of being close to something. Now, that's not how everybody uses poetics. So again, I'm not speaking truth here. I'm maneuvering toward an understanding that I hope will create a certain space within the question that will allow us to continue talking and not to reach an endpoint with this. The purpose is never to reach an endpoint, but to create a sort of platform upon which we can have a more profoundly rewarding engagement with the question. That's the best we can hope for. Nor should we wish for anything greater. That would be my point. In order to, how you would apply this historically is of course problematic, and I'm not going to engage that question much because I'm not very interested in it now. I've been interested in it most of my life, but I'm less interested in it now because I realize that every act of description that has ever occurred to me about any point in art that I've been, or poetry or music that I've been interested in, historically, culturally, interculturally, whatever, has only been useful briefly. And that if I got too interested in it, I found it was it kind of deadened the question. So that's the problem of scholarship. That's the problem of our relationship to what we call culture. Because while in our better mind we think of a culture as a beautiful expression of the best that a people have to offer, that's only one side of it. The other side of it is the culture is what's driving down all of the things that don't make sense within it. It marginalizes everything else. So it's an oppressive, conservative force, and it gets opposed by people who get impatient with the results of that, because they're among the marginalized. But obviously, we don't have to go there, because that's the question of the day. It's the question of any day. And we're living in a context in which we can apply that question, that problematic, to practically everything that you read in the newspaper or encounter in a single day. So, can we engage these questions in such a way that we don't back off from the importance of being politically alive and relevant and effective on all levels of what it means to be politically effective, and yet allow ourselves to explore this in a way that will actually be transformative in some way, that it will actually make some kind of a difference in how we embody the art form. And can you practice an art form with that kind of question in mind? And can you practice meditation in that kind of activity? Because, I mean, your meditation is not an escape from your political truth, right? And yet, we manage to pull ourselves toward the atemporal, which I think would be a fairly good category, if we need a category for what any kind of meditative or spiritual practice is. It's an engagement with something that is not expressed well by notions of time in itself, and yet we're constantly in the presence of having to integrate that with what's actually happening around us. So that tension seems to be permanent. We never experience for very long, except by illusion or by exclusion, being outside of that tension. That tension is there at every second. And if you forget about one side of it, you might trip over something and break your neck, or break somebody else's neck. Okay, I'm gonna read a couple of statements that I came up with thinking about being here tonight, and see what that does in this process. Is my distinction between concept and principle okay, clear enough for us to move forward from that point? Okay. Everything I'm going to say to you is going to be a concept. It's going to be it may be a concept about a principle, but it's going to be a concept. Question is, can I talk to you tonight in such a way, since I have not planned what I'm saying, that you will have a feeling for, a sense of my claim that principle is of this nature that I'm describing, and that would be helpful to you in some way. I mean, you're not here to be entertained. If you are, you're being disappointed. You're here for whatever reason you're here, but we're here to find out what we can know by engaging someone else's mind about this. My great desire is not to lie to you by claiming that I'm telling you the truth. There's a paradox in here of our high regard for the truth and what it means to lie. So I'm going to say a couple of things here. This is something I'm going to read you what I wrote to Stephen on my way here. When I sent you as a text message, which I wrote in the limousine to the airport. the real poetics of awakening mind is subversion of repression, ripping away the lie tissue of language. The problematic with sacred discourse is the perceived need to assert, to be for a definable good. Hence, the corruption of voice that speaks to appease or to please. The true poetic pulls no punches. Poetics for the maker is the pursuit of incorruptible speaking. No doctrine, only a matrix that serves. So I say that poetics begins with the recognition that every act of language is right on the edge of saying something that is true in the sense of being valuable, and a falsification of the possibilities that that act excludes. How do you talk about the pursuit of something like enlightenment and not falsify the path? I find myself often listening to sacred teachings, so-called, that's what we call them, whatever they really are. We regard them as teachings, as some kind of pro forma engagement with something that the person speaking knows, but is not in the presence of a language possibility that will communicate it. The way around that, for people who engage with teachers, is not to listen to the language as though it's saying a thing, but to be in touch with the mind of the being who's speaking. And so poetics is an attempt to do something like that without requiring belief on the part of the listener. How do you have a sacred situation in which we valorize a notion like enlightenment or awakening without requiring belief, which is fundamentally the opposite of enlightenment? The act of belief is not what gets you awake. When you believe something, it stops right there. Very interesting how James Hillman talked about dreams, for instance. I think he's come up in this course, probably, right? At some point. So Hillman. Hillman, talking about dreams, says, here we are, psychologists, been talking about dreams in incredibly rich and powerful ways for all of the time we've been talking about it. And what this seems to lead to is the interpretation of the dream. And he said the problem is that when you interpret the dream, you kill the dream. The dream stops at that point. It stops talking to you. The dream is a force of mind and being that is happening inside you as the experiencer of that. That may be very uncomfortable, or it may be very beautiful. It may be all the things that our dreams can be, and they're never one thing. And it's very hard to find an encompassing category, as hard as we have tried throughout civilization to deal with this phenomenon that everybody has realized is incredibly powerful. How do we deal with that in such a way that we don't undercut what it's trying to do, or what it seems to have as purpose? I mean, if you want to take a physiological view of dream, you might say that dream is there to preserve sleep so you don't wake up. That's probably the most trivial view of dreaming I've ever heard. But all those wonderful dreams are just there so I don't wake up, so I get a good night's sleep. Amazing. I mean, practically no idea of dream actually is satisfying if you're the dreamer. And what Hillman was after was the recognition that the dream has a primary force of its own, that it is what it is, as much as anything is what it is, and that as soon as you think you understand what it's saying to you, you hang up the phone. But that there are other ways of dealing with the dream, because if instead of interpreting the dream, you allow the dream to continue to be a presence, unresolved. That's what my Oniropia course was actually about. When I taught this course way back in ancient times, what I asked people to do is not to try to describe the dream that you had, but to keep your pad and pencil by your bed. So this is what everybody was doing as a practice. And as soon as you woke up and you were, whatever fragment or tiny little sliver of dream activity was there, and started to say, what was that dream? Why, fuck that was so important. I can't remember what that was. And spend all day trying to remember that dream. That's very frustrating activity, and it barely does much good. The dream comes back if it comes back, and doesn't if it doesn't. But if you had this gentler lightness of touch to the dream, where you're not challenging it to be coherent, you're not trying to turn it into a narrative, so that it could be another one of the great stories in your life, which, if it's going to be that, it's going to be that. But it doesn't have to be that. There are terrains of dream. We marginalize the less coherent. What was it that Robert Duncan poet said? At root, our fundamental taboo is against unintelligibility. We have a very deep taboo. It's a taboo against the unintelligible. So we do everything to draw it into our conceptual, coherent, satisfying, don't have to think about it anymore because I know what it is. Relief from the tension of not knowing. So we actually have something that has the status of a taboo against that. It's not okay for you not to understand your behavior, or your activity, or your life, or whatever, your mind, or God, or we have to understand all of this, or it's not real. But what if you'd have to take the opposite approach and say everything is in brackets from start to finish? There is nothing that isn't in brackets. Therefore, we can go into the bracket or come out of the bracket without disturbing its tentative and approximate nature, or whatever, however we want to call that state of incompletion. But allow the dream to be a presence like a person in the room. If I think I understand you, I've stopped listening to you. You know, you're no longer a primary presence for me. I can say, okay, I'll be back a little later. I'm going to go now talk to this other person that I don't understand, much more interesting to me. Now that I understand you. And the dream is probably, in some sense, offended by our effort to draw it into excessive coherence. It's of a different nature. And we're not very good with things of a different nature, basically, as a people. Whatever species we are, we're not very good with things that we don't understand well. We don't like people who are too different from us. We don't like cultures that we don't work well inside. We want things to be convenient. And conceptualization as an act is essentially an act of convenience. We want the world to be convenience. We want our car to run. So, poetics is not about understanding all of this stuff. Poetics is about refining our relationship to this powerful reality that is unknowable, and how to keep it in a status that it continues to speak to us like the dream. How do we consult it? How do we establish a relationship with it? Which, if we could do, we probably would teach us how to better establish relationship with each other as unknowns, as known unknown, known unknown, known unknown. So poetics is that kind of, as I understand it, as I'm presenting it here. Now I'm going to approach this a little more like I'm recognizing when we talk about poetics, we're talking about language, and we're talking about text, and we're talking about something that we do, make, read, and what the relationship of those can be. The poem, the book, the page, the line is a meeting place of forces discriminated therein. It pulls you into the state of their interaction. Where it goes from there is where you go within it. Maybe I should read that again. The poem, the book, the page, the line is a meeting place of forces. Okay. It's an object. I start here and I end here. I expect it to do well what it's attempting to do, whatever that is. But what is the book? What is the page? So if you approach it from the point of view of how that arises inside your experience, if you are a poet, and I want to extend the definition of poet to every active mind that allows the poetic to be. It's a meeting place of forces discriminated therein. It pulls you into the state of the interaction of these forces, their interaction. Where it goes from there is where you go within it. The reader is not fundamentally in a different position from the writer, from this point of view. So, this is a serious paradox that I'm going to explore as the next stage in not telling you anything. The teacher in this model is only slightly different from the disciple. Now, that's going to cause problems right away because we want to think the teacher's way up here and the disciple's way down here. But if the teacher's really up here and the disciple's really down here, not much is going to happen between them. The teacher and the disciple have to have points where there's some kind of approximate connection between them. Even in the most exalted idea of the teacher, there's only if you're ready to meet that teacher at that exalted level is it going to be of any value to you, because otherwise you're going to get very, very bored, and you're not going to see any reason why you should stay there. So the poem and the reader. Now, by the way, by poem, I want to include all sacred text that's effective. Because, a poem is at least telling you or engaging you with a reality that you didn't have before. If you're reading poetry for the great golden moments that you will return to and make you feel the warm the way you felt when you were 14, that's a real and prevalent use of poetry. And it's kind of escapist and all that. And I'm not belittling it, by the way. That has a function, just like old songs and old movies and memories and old pictures and all of that. And I'm not belittling it. I'm just saying that's what that is. But I'm not talking about that. I'm not talking about the poetry that makes you feel good and happy and real and helps you get over things and helps you get out from under things. I'm not against escapism, by the way. I'm for escapism. escapism is a fundamental good that human beings have created, because the one thing you're escaping is your own rigidity. And if, you know, the whole idea that we should escape from escapism is nonsense. It's impossible. And I'm not against denial. I think denial can be a positive force in human life. I mean, if you really want to think about all the worst things that could be possible right now that are going on in your body and your mind and your life, right, you can do that, you know. But I'm not so sure it's pretty useful. So, you know, these categories that there is the higher good and the lower bad or whatever are not very useful from the point of view of what we're talking about. We were having this discussion about the dictionary, Webster's second versus Webster's third. When Webster's third came out, it created a panic amongst the literati because it seemed to remove a lot of words that everybody loved and couldn't, oh God, my words no longer in this book. And it didn't tell you anymore quite so much which were the true uses of word, or the better uses of word, or the higher uses of the word. And it didn't diss the words that you weren't supposed to use quite as much as the previous ones had. And so this was Dwight MacDonald came out with a famous essay denouncing the Webster's third as civilization going down the toilet because the Webster's third had done this. And they actually reprinted the Webster's second. There was so much, you know, protest against this. But I loved the Western third when it came out, Webster's third, because it was so clean. It just gave you this word that, and it did allow you to know that, you know, a certain percentage of readers would use this word, or writers would use this word, and not use this word. That's okay. That's okay to know that. That's information. I'd like to know that. So in case I'm writing to the president, I don't use the word. Only 30% of intelligent readers use. But nevertheless, there was something clean about being delivered of the baggage of civilizations telling you what language is supposed to be. Somehow along the way, we got this idea that the function of culture and language and education was to tell you what is good and okay to use. And so culture becomes an extremely repressive force. And poetry is damaged by this. And as William Blake says, when you damage poetry, you damage all humanity. You damage the nation. You damage language. So if a poet is engaged with language the way a doctor is engaged with medicine, the fundamental principle should be do no harm. We should be able to honor the vehicle of the language that is there to engage us with this primary good, this reality, this thing that's trying to come across to us, that's worth putting into the form of poem or whatever. We should respect that vehicle as a clean way of engaging this without burdening us with other people's repressive ideas. How can you do that? And if enlightenment, ultimately, whatever it is an awakening that has no room left in it for repression. There's no space left in that for repression. How can we talk about it in a language that doesn't do that? And if we start to invoke these primary goods that we're supposed to think that they're good no matter what, aren't we damaging the very thing that we're trying to touch and be in contact with? That's my question. So what I'm saying is that we might use a service model if you want to be Buddhist in your attitude toward poetics. One of the ways of doing that would be to look at it as bodhisattva activity, as service. But what does that mean? if it has anything other than an honorific and exalted value, that the great bodhisattvas are great because they've been said to be great and that we're supposed to honor them, to me it can only mean if it actually works, if it actually generates the state of which it speaks. Anything that iconizes itself beyond the function is not performing the activity. It's not doing Buddha activity or Bodhisattva activity at all, in my view. And if we want to talk about the poetics of that, we have to get down to some pretty fundamental stuff and understand that at every moment we're engaged with repression. I mean, at least that part of Western psychology has been very valuable to awaken us to how pervasive that phenomenon is and how many ways it is. So studying the detail of that is endlessly valuable because we get to see what we can see. We get to see how much there is to see. Am I running up against a sacred moment here when I'm supposed to shut up?
When your tape runs out.
Huh?
Your tape is about to run out.
If you find a moment.
You can take a break.
Yeah. Should
So,
we pause?
huh?
We can pause here.
You want to pause? There's no better time to pause than mid-sentence.
We can keep that.
And you have to come back to hear the rest of the sentence.
So, we can change it. So, yeah. As Trungpa Rinpoche once said, the bad news is we're all falling in space. The good news is we'll never ever land. So we can continue to not land and be back in maybe 15 minutes at the most. Huh? Okay, thank you.
Oh, by the way,